if you do a guest interview every single week, that's only 52 slots that a podcast has got in a year. That's not actually that many. And, if you look at other podcasts, some podcasters will only do an interview every second episode or once a month. So you really got to make sure that you stand out, because you could be essentially vying for only 12 interviews throughout a whole year for certain podcasts. And I think people forget that sometimes as well when it comes to the quality of their pitches.
Welcome to the Communication Queens podcast for the visionary leaders, speakers, service providers, and podcasters who are looking to stand out sharing their story. I'm your host, Kimberly Spencer, former screenwriter turned master communications coach. On this podcast, I'll be coaching you on how to share your own transformation story so that you increase your visibility, influence, and income on podcast interviews. Let's get your voice heard. This special episode of the Communication Queen podcast is brought to you by our podcasting parties. We host bi-monthly free podcast parties where you have the opportunity to meet top 5% ranked podcasts and a few global top 100 podcasters. From our visibility challenge and infamous podcast bingo to our pitch please competition, you have 3 opportunities to not only pitch yourselves and get visible from these podcast parties, you also have the opportunity to win hundreds of dollars worth of prizes that will help you generate your next 6 figures from guest podcasting. 80% of attendees at our podcast parties end up getting booked on at least 1, if not 3 podcasts. Other attendees have gone on to get clients, form joint venture partnerships, and get amazing referrals, connections, and build their network with a better understanding of which podcasts are the best fit for their business, their brand awareness, and their bottom line. I am so excited to open up the invitation for you to come in, join us on the 1st and 3rd Friday of the month at 1 p.m. CST. I'll see you at the next one. Verity, you started your podcast after having a baby.
Yep.
Walk me through that decision.
Do you know what? This is going to sound ridiculous, but I'm still not entirely sure what the decision was. I'll tell you the story for context and tell me if I'm babbling, but I feel like this story adds context to the whole crazy journey that has been the last few years. So it was just before Christmas a few years ago. I honestly forget which year it was now. It must have been like 2021, something like that. Anyway, I turned around to my husband and I've got no idea why, what possessed me in, post-baby craziness. I said, I think I want to start a podcast. And he was like, great, I know what to get you for Christmas now. So we got me my microphone. But I hadn't actually put any thought process into creating a podcast. It was just, I think I'm going to create a podcast. And this microphone sat on the desk for something like 3-4 months until I was like, I need to actually do something with this. Like, it's a really nice gift and I've done nothing with this. And I just sat down one day, I had the baby in the bouncer. She was like 4 months old. And I just started recording what I felt was waffle. And then I published some episodes and it kind of gained some traction and it kept going. And that podcast went for about 18 months until I was like, the conversation's been had, moved on to the podcast that I've got now. But the whole thing was just a bit of I think almost like, you know what this is like. You've got kids, when you've had kids and everything in your day is just around nappies, feed times, change times, school runs, all that kind of thing. And I just needed something where I was like, it's not the baby, it's not the housework, it's just something that is totally different and totally for me. And podcasting was just kind of there. It's the weirdest story. And now it's just become a bit of I call it a hobby that's got out of control because all I do now is talk about podcasting.
I love it because, I'm the weirdo who has twins. I start a business with every baby that I have. So I completely understand the desire of that mom desire where, especially as infants, like you and I had a conversation prior and I was like, the infant stage for me was actually really easy. Like, I was like, is there more to, because they're not in an age where they can get into too much trouble. Like they're not climbing up the staircase. There's no conversation to be had. So it's very
serene in a way that there's like, is there anything else to this?
And my second one was a sleeper as well. So it was even more of a case of, well, I need to be doing something. So it was a filler for maternity leave, I suppose. And I just haven't stopped.
Yeah. So what has podcast brought you? What has it given you?
This is going to sound so cheesy, but it's the connections I've got with people. I have made some truly amazing friendships through podcasting. And this one will make you laugh. I met a girl. We ended up starting podcasting around the same time. And I don't even know how. It was some kind of Instagram conversation or something, slid into each other's DMs. And we have been chatting on Zoom every week for the last 2.5, 3 years. We're meeting up in person next month. And I am so excited. And it's just the most surreal thing. But I would honestly say it's the friendships. I have met so many amazing people. I mean, you're in the podcasting space. You know how amazing the podcasting community is. And I think it's getting to know more people and just being able to share that passion of podcasting. And yeah, I really think it's just that connection.
So what are your most nosy, curious questions that you have asked or get asked on podcasts that you love answering or that you love asking?
I think the nosiest questions I probably ask other people are probably the most forward questions, in terms of I've had people who are experts in their field on podcast episodes before, where I have just gone straight in for the jugular and be like, so how exactly do you do this? I need your secret sauce right now. Just tell me. And I find that a lot of people are almost not very prepared for that. But I'm but that's what my audience wants. They want to know tips and tricks and, insider kind of information. So, if you're coming on and you're talking about, I don't know, that you're an expert in selling on TikTok, I will be straight in and being like, so what exactly, not that I interview people on TikTok, but it's not my brand, but you get my point. It would be a case of, exactly what strategy do you use? What kind of software do you use? How can you help people do this? And because I find a lot of people, they try, shift around a little bit. So I find that those are probably my nosiest questions, is those how-to kind of questions. And the questions that I've got asked, to be honest with you, the curveball ones tend to be about where I'm from, because I'm from Jersey and it's not New Jersey. It's okay. It's not New Jersey in the States. So a lot of people are like, but where's Jersey? And is there electricity over there? And do they drive over there? And yeah, so those are probably the most curveball ones that I get asked.
I love that you go for the jugular, because I do too. And I think that that's such a powerful question. And I think one of the biggest pet peeves that I see, and one of the challenges, especially with people who start going on podcasts, especially bigger guests, is when they hide those tips, tricks, strategies behind their program wall. Or oh, you have to buy the book, or you have to buy the course. And what have you noticed as an industry expert, as being the most valuable guest since most of our audience are people who are wanting to guest more and who have done incredibly amazing accomplishments and who have great products, great programs. But for me, that's my pet peeve as a podcaster and interviewer, is when you're hiding things constantly behind the book or the course. How do you pull or extract that information when you notice a guest is kind of wanting to hide their info or their best tips and tricks behind the course?
I love that. I would say that most of the time I'm very choosy about who I have on my podcast. So if I have maybe listened to some episodes before and I've kind of got the vibe that actually the whole of the interview is just one massive sales pitch, then you're probably not going to be the kind of vibe for my podcast. I am very, very choosy, I have to say. But I find that the people who are just like, do you know what? I'm giving you the information here and I'm giving it to you for free. But if you buy my course or you buy my book, you're going to get the same information, but you're going to get it in a more succinct format, or in a one-to-one format, or in a delivery which is maybe a bit more personalized to you. And those are the kind of people who I'm like, you are going to be an amazing guest. And also, I think those are the kinds of guests as well that people end up wanting to buy the book or the course or whatever it is from, because they're not feeling, I mean, you know what it's like, you know, when you listen to like an entire episode of something and then you're like, oh, you just want me to buy something. I was at a conference last year and there was somebody on stage and they were giving this really interesting talk all about whatever topic it was. And then after 45 minutes, it kind of, the penny drops and you just watch the whole of the audience, because actually the entire thing was just a sales pitch into something that their company was selling. And it just didn't sit right with the audience, as opposed to people who had been in earlier in the day who were just giving away so much information for free. You're like, well, I actually want to go to your website now. I want to find out more about you, because if that's what you're giving away for free, what is your book, your course, your membership, whatever it is, what is that gonna look like? So I would say I'm very choosy, and I tend to kind of search out people and hunt out people, and sometimes I just have to go with the, I'm very sorry, but my content calendar is full. And 99% of the time that is actually true, but there is that very small percentage of the time where I'm like, I don't want you using my podcast as just advertising space.
100%. And I think, because I've been to those presentations before and those talks at conferences and things, and you're like, is there anything beyond the product that you're saying that we should buy in order to get the results that are, you know, marketed in the topic of the course? And I too see the reverse effect of like when you're so generous, because, and I really think it comes down to a mindset piece ultimately, because there's no way in a book that's 150 pages that you can cover all of that in a 30-minute or 1-hour podcast interview. There's just no way. Like the audiobook is not even going to cover that. And so I think that it really comes down to that abundance mindset of being the go-giver. And especially more than any other medium, more than like social media, more than any other marketing medium, podcasting specifically, because of the nature of the intimacy of the environment. I mean, look at me, and like I got my kid hanging out with me at a podcast interview. We've all been there. Like every mom has been there. Every single mom. Literally the boys popped in for a podcast interview on like that I was on. For that they have like over 150,000 monthly downloads, and the boys popped in and they of course dropped their new favorite words of but.
And they'll say, but they will be running their own podcast editing agency by the age of 10 or something. So,
exactly. You know. I'm not surprised. My 6-year-old wants to start a podcast. So I think that there is.
It is my 9-year-old. Maybe they should buddy up.
They could buddy up. Do they want to? Does your 9-year-old want to interview astronomers and rocket scientists?
Yes.
No way.
Yes. She wants to be an astronaut.
So does my son. This is exactly the demonstration of it happening.
Exactly. The power of podcasting. Definitely.
Because it really comes from collaboration. And the attitude, collaboration stems from abundance, not just from a scarcity thinking of like just trying to make the next buck or trying to sell your course or your book. So have you ever thrown a podcast episode out because someone was too pitchy?
Am I allowed to say no?
No!
Well, not because they were so pitchy. Well, they sort of were, but it was, oh God, how can I kind of say this? Basically, the whole tone of the conversation just took this direction, which we had not previously discussed. It was not what the episode was about. And it didn't matter how many times I tried to bring it back to the main point of what we were going to, it just kept going so off tangent. And I got to the point, I ended up speaking to one of my friends about it. I was like, I can't put this episode out, because I said it is just so worlds away from my brand, from what my audience has come to expect from this podcast, that I was like, I can't put it out. And it was such a moral dilemma, because I'm a people pleaser at the end of the day. And all I could think was, oh, they've given up their time for this interview. But it just, yeah, there were tech issues. Let's just say there were tech issues. That sounds awful. No, everybody who's ever been on my podcast now is going to be like, oh, was that me?
Was that me? Yeah. Well, I think so many people, like, especially if you go on a lot of podcasts, like there are so many podcasts that I've been on that if it wasn't for my team having followed up with every podcast that we go on or that our clients go on, we wouldn't know which ones get distributed. Because quite frankly, like some podcasters, they just get pod fade and they end up not distributing your episode. It's not necessarily just because, your episodes sucked or you were too pitchy. It can sometimes be because they just got pod fade and just burn out.
Definitely. And I think that's a really important thing to consider is when, anyone who's listening to this episode now and is thinking, I really want to go on different podcasts, is really considering to yourself, is that podcast proven enough to be on? So I went on a podcast a couple of hours ago, actually, and I just realized if these come out at the same kind of time, everyone's going to be like, why is she wearing exactly the same thing? There we go. That is why, because I'm recording them in the same day. But the podcast that I went on earlier, it was the first episode that this particular podcast has ever done. And ordinarily, I would be like, no, because you and I are the same mind on this completely, that they need to be proven. They need to have, consistent episodes coming out, reviews, all, the whole shebang. But this was the very first episode. And do you know what? The reason I said yes is because both of the hosts have both got their own podcasts, which have been going for a very, very long time. And they have essentially just teamed up to do, I think it's like their fourth podcast or something. But the point is that ordinarily I'd be like, no, first podcast, first episode, no, this isn't going to happen. But they have the track record from other podcasts. So I think that that's also another important thing, is that if you are going on a brand new podcast, yes, there is so much opportunity to be heard from that because, so many people will go back to episode 1. But as you said, if people go into pod fade and the podcast only lasts about 3 episodes, 8 episodes, then is anybody actually you've put in a lot of time and effort into guesting on that, and your message is potentially not getting out to anybody. So it's a tricky one. I'm not saying don't guest on any new podcast, but go in with a mindset of how, what is the long-term vision for the podcast that I'm guesting on, I think would probably be the takeaway from that.
100%, because I too, we have a very specific vetting process that if you want to learn our vetting process, go to episode 2 as far as just the basic, our basic requirements. But beyond that vetting process, like there are occasionally times that I will go on a first time podcast. And like you, I make sure that they're either a seasoned podcaster or a seasoned business owner. Like my friend, Lindsay Epperly, she launched her podcast, Who Made You the Boss? She's built a huge multi-million-dollar travel agency, and she had Amy Porterfield on as her first guest. Like, wow. Can you please put that down, my love? No, do we have poopy? Hold on just a second. Let me just get my husband.
You're absolutely fine. Don't worry.
For your patience.
It's all right. Don't worry.
I know, Emma. We've all been there. It's the first time I've had someone poop on my podcast. So it's a win.
Take it as a win. Like, I don't know, tweet about that or Instagram story about that, because that is a relatable moment if ever that was one. I think the first time, I'm trying to think, when my first podcast was out, so this was the one I did in mat leave, so it was called The Confident CEO, and I had one of my first guests on, and I was super nervous because I was really excited to interview this girl. She's called Crystal and she's incredible. She's got a podcast called She Calls Her Shots, and she is a seasoned photographer and really, really crazy knowledgeable about business and business mindset and things. Mm-hmm. So I was having her on my podcast, super excited, and I was prepared. In my mind, I had everything prepped. It was beautiful. And then I just kind of sniffed the air and the baby who was in the baby bouncer. Yep, you can just imagine the end of that sentence.
Yes.
And because she was like, 4 months old, something like that. And I was there scrambling, because it wasn't one that could, it had to be cleaned up. You know the kind that I mean.
Yes. Yeah.
And so I was there cleaning. It makes me sound like I wouldn't clean up my child. That's not what I meant, but you know what I mean. Parents out there understand what I mean by this.
Yes.
And I had to fully clean her up, and I was there one-handedly trying to clean her up, one-handedly trying to desperately DM Krista and be like, I am so sorry, but my child has just exploded in front of me, and I am logging on. Just give me 5 minutes. And I thought, she is going to think that I've just not got anything together, let alone Anyway, 2 years later, she still talks to me, which is lovely. And again, another beautiful friendship that came out of podcasting. But yes, I will never forget the first time that I properly spoke to her. And I was like, I'm so sorry, my child has just, like I said, exploded all everywhere. And you're just going to have to wait 10 minutes because she cannot.
Yeah. And every parent out there understands that moment of like, could it wait 20 minutes?
Yes.
Could it wait? Like I had one podcast, 9 minutes before I was like getting ready. I was all ready to go on this one podcast interview, and our goat gives birth. And so I like normally with animals giving birth, you don't really have to do much, but because we have a donkey who gets very tribal, you want to separate the babies so the donkey doesn't trample the babies. And so it was the first experience in our new home with like our small farm that we had just that came with the home. That I was like, I gotta run and like save the goat. So I saved the goat, moved it with my husband, and then ran back and was only 2 minutes late for the podcast interview.
I love that though, because that sounds like, when you'd go to school and say the dog ate my homework, well, the goat's just given birth. It sounds like that kind of thing, doesn't it? Like, is really?
Yeah, it really does. Like one time I had to stop a podcast interview because my 2-year-old was running out to go pet the donkey. And I was like, no, because the donkey it's gated, but he sometimes will stick his hands through the gate. Yeah. And I didn't want the donkey to bite his hand because the donkey has like carrots or apples. So
yes.
Like, and I remember the podcast going like, wait, I'm sorry, you just said donkey? Like, which is great because it does provide for a level of relatability and authenticity. Yeah. It's something that's weird and different and that actually creates memorability and relatability. Like every parent can relate to those moments of just the poopy diaper explosion.
Absolutely. And I think it's a really crucial thing to talk about as well, because I think that there are so many amazing women. Obviously, there's a load of amazing men in podcasting as well, but I think there's a load of amazing women who have the potential to have podcasts, but don't, because they're like, but what if the kids run in and what if this happens? And, I've got the kids, and actually, do you know what? My podcast works around the kids. Your podcast works around the kids. And at the end of the day, nobody actually minds if the kids, I don't know if this hit the global news, but there was, during the pandemic, there was, I don't know, some kind of ministry person, parliament person, somebody very, very important in government who, in the UK, who was being interviewed for one of the national news stations. And he's there, like, really serious, suit, probably still had his pajamas on the bottom half, but, suit on. It was all very serious, talking about the pandemic and, all that terrible things that were happening at that time. And as if by magic, the office door behind him opened up and this baby in this 4-wheeler just comes in. And the nanny literally like throws herself across the floor to drag him out, the little baby out. And this little 5-second clip just went, it was everywhere, all over the news. And nobody knew what the heck this bloke was actually on the news to talk about. Everybody was just like, hey, he's got his kids at home, just like me. Well, do you know what? We don't feel so bad now when our kids come in the Zoom meetings with us. And it breaks it down and just remembers that, reminds everybody that we're all just human at the end of the day. And I think there's almost this movement. I don't know if you've seen it, but I feel like there's almost a bit of a movement where, polished perfection, particularly for indie podcasters, it just doesn't really need to be a thing. Nobody's coming for the, the most highly edited things. And it's like you said, it's the relatability of it that I think people enjoy more. Maybe I'm wrong, but
there is a great podcast network of women called the SWE Entrepreneur Network, and they don't edit their podcast. Like, that's one of their rules. And I've heard from multiple podcasters, indie podcasters especially, that are like, yeah, I've had my audience be like, where's the unedited version? Like, it's nice to feel like it's almost like the reality TV that we no longer really have because we now have Netflix. And so it's like you get to hear that backstage, peek into people's actual lives. And I remember that story because it did make international news.
Oh, did it?
It did, because I was living in Australia at the time and I saw it on the news at the gym and I was like, that's so cool. My kids do that too. And I genuinely think that if someone who has a serious or significant problem, then great, because they just weeded themselves out of my world. Like, I think we can all do with giving each other a little bit of grace. Like, there is a line of professionalism of like showing up, send a message if you've got to change a dirty nappy right before. But ultimately, there is a line of grace because I think the pandemic was great in the fact that it blew up the boxes of like, here's my work box and then here's my home life box. And it's like, no, we're all holistic human beings. We all have, lives or cats or kids or dogs or something else in our world that is impacting how we show up. And when we can honor that and come from a place of true authenticity, it takes people off the pedestal, which is great, because when you're on a pedestal, it really, really sucks. Like, it's because it's very easy to get knocked down. And it reminds me of this time back in like 2013. Do you remember when like Jennifer Lawrence and Anne Hathaway were both like on the scene going for their Oscars?
Yes. Was that 2013?
Yeah, it was like 2013. And
wow.
I know, it's ages. Yeah, ages ago. And Jennifer Lawrence was getting all this praise because she was like, I'm eating McDonald's out of the limo and flipping off the paparazzi. And Anne Hathaway got she just got attacked by the press. And there was actually like a 1.3 million. I Google searched it because I am writing my book for Make Every Podcast Want You about this perfection paradigm. And there was actually a search for Anne Hathaway annoying that it had like 1.3 million hits on it because her PR team, I'm going to assume it's her PR team, I don't know her personally, but was positioning her as like, here is this poised, perfect Academy Award winning actress. And people were eviscerating her online. And seeing that, it's because our subconscious minds, like, we know we're not perfect. And so when we see someone who's posturing or positioned, or whose teams are even positioning them as being perfect, then we distrust that naturally. That's why people gravitate to the Kardashians, because we see their flaws, at least with all the flaws they want us to see on their show. And they love it. They are aware of that paradigm.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think you're so right. And I think it's interesting, isn't it? Because when you were saying about reality TV as well, because back in the day, reality TV was just so scripted, wasn't it? And yes, okay, there is a lot of scripting still to reality TV, but like you said, even the stuff you see on Netflix now, it's much more raw. And there's this real rise, isn't there? There's so many new and up and coming artists and people creating so much content in so many different multitudes, which is just much more real. And I think that's what I love about podcasting, because as you said, it's just this peek into somebody's day, into somebody's life. And I love the fact that you're saying that there's so many people, but I very, very rarely edit my episodes. And I will edit because sometimes I'll be chatting along and I'll go, do you know, I've just lost my train of thought completely. And then there'll just be a 5-minute silence where I have to, kind of think, where am I? What am I doing? What point was I making? Is it that I'll edit out? But by and large, I don't bother with things. I had the cat walk in the other day and start meowing, and I just turned around and I said, look, I'm really sorry, but the cat's here and you're just going to have to live with that, basically, because that's just how this episode is rolling for today. And I just think it's nice. I mean, I was listening to a podcast just the other day, and it's huge over here. Absolutely. What's it called? The Rest is History. It's a huge history podcast. And I was listening to it, and it's got so many plosives in it because of how they're sitting with the microphone. But I was like, do you know what? I don't really care, because it's the content that I want, not how polished the output is.
100%. And I love that you are bringing such authenticity. And I'm wondering, do you think that there ever is a tipping point? Like, there's a tipping point with perfectionism, with it being, everything's so polished and perfect. But do you think that there is a pendulum swing in the reverse, where there's a tipping point where there's actually too much authenticity, where there's too much rawness, realness, or expression?
I think that's a really interesting question. And I would say I think it probably depends on you and depends on your podcast audience. So for me, I would say that there's probably too much authenticity if your editing is just so, say it's obvious that you stood in the middle of town with like the worst quality microphone ever and you've tried to interview people and all you can hear is like the wind and all this kind of thing. That for me is a bit too much authenticity because I don't want to feel like I'm stuck in a wind tunnel or something listening to you, because I can, watch the news or just go outside myself for that. So I feel like that might be it. I feel as well that if you're trying to kind of, maybe if you're going through something and you haven't fully dealt with that and you were then interviewing people around a certain subject, that could be quite challenging maybe to listen to. I don't know. I think it's difficult because I think sometimes, I guess what I'm saying is that if you are using almost like your podcast as therapy and your audience aren't prepared for that, that could be a bit too authentic for some listeners. But then I guess you could get around that in terms of like a disclaimer or something. But because you know how people back in the day used to do blogging like that, didn't you? And blogging can be very therapeutic. And I'm sure there's a lot of people who do use podcasts for therapy and what have you for a whole multitude of things. But I think it needs to sit right with you and with your audience and make sure that there's nothing wrong with being vulnerable. But I think that you don't want to make yourself so vulnerable that actually you're opening yourself up to potential other issues, if that makes sense. If you maybe haven't dealt with something that you're talking about and then people approach you, ask questions, leave comments online, even if it's coming from a good place, if you haven't dealt with something that could, potentially trigger you to go into a different path or what have you. So I would say that I think you could pendulum swing either from like an editing quality point of view or the content. But as I said, I think a lot of it just depends on your audience, because I do think the thing that I always say to people is that there are 7 billion people on this planet. There will be at least one person who will listen to your podcast and will like your podcast.
It's true. I mean, even when you're just starting out, I remember I was coaching a podcaster a few years ago and she was like, oh, only like 50 people are listening to my podcast. I was like, have you been in a room with 50 people? You're literally teaching a micro workshop every single week.
Exactly. I was going to say, would she fit 50 people in her living room? Yeah. Probably not. Would she get 50 people in her kitchen? Probably not. That's amazing.
Yeah, 50 people is extraordinary. And so and it actually puts you in the top 50% of podcasts.
Exactly.
Before Kajabi, I used to have my businesses in all different platforms in all different places, and it was a complicated duct tape mess. Once we combined all our CRM, our customer relationship management, our podcast, our website, our marketing emails, our sequences, our affiliate partners all into the Kajabi platform, it was a game changer. As you know, I love simplicity, and we love to keep it real and with a real deal here at the Communication Queen podcast. And that is what Kajabi is all about. It is the #1 most trusted platform to monetize your knowledge. So click the link below to grab your 30-day trial for Kajabi. And now let's go back to the episode.
And so when we think of these metrics, I think we sometimes lose sight of like with the big giant social numbers. And as a podcaster and someone who books people on podcasts, with our company, like one of the things I see people defaulting to is like, oh, let's check if this potential guest has the right size of social numbers. Have you seen a direct translation from your social numbers from your podcast or from your guests going on a podcast to building up your social numbers? Because I've spoken to several podcast producers who manage multiple podcasts, and so far I've yet to see that there's a correlation between the social media audience and the podcasting audience.
I love this question so much because in my personal experience, I have found that it is the guests with the smaller social media followings that do better for their guest episodes. I've only had one person who that has not been the norm or like the rule for. But I would say that in my experience, I've had a couple of guests on who have got like tens of thousands followers on just one platform. one platform, I can't talk, and they're across multiple platforms. So like their reach is huge. And that does not translate to listens at all. And I think that that really then speaks to that quality over quantity. Just because somebody who's got, let's say, 10,000 listeners on Instagram does not mean that all 10,000 of those people are suddenly going to come and listen to that one episode. Because the way that I see it as well is like, you know, let's say that you're a Katy Perry fan. Let's say, for argument's sake, that Katy Perry is on a podcast. Just because you're a Katy Perry fan, are you going to go and listen to that podcast episode? Well, probably not. So then why, if you are following someone on Instagram, would you go and listen to their episode on another podcast? But people seem to think that if someone's got 10,000 followers on Instagram, they're suddenly going to get like 10,000 listens. And you're like, just no. Just like I said, I've had one person where there was a significant spike, but their large audience is an incredibly engaged audience. I would say my experience has been the smaller Instagram followers, the smaller tweet followers, Twitter followers, etc. They've been more engaged, and they have tended to be the people who have engaged with those episodes. Mm-hmm. So yeah, definitely, I would say don't fall into the trap, anyone listening, thinking you have to book, you know, these people with, you know, millions followers, because it doesn't necessarily translate over into podcast stats.
Mm-hmm. And not only that, it doesn't necessarily also translate into it being a quality guest.
100%. And I think that's another really important thing as well, is it's making sure that you're not just booking people based on their followership or, you know, how amazing their Instagram comments are or whatever. It's, well, what are their brands? What are their values? Does that translate across to your brands and values? And also, does it marry up with the message that you want to put out and your podcast to be aligned with? Now, sometimes that doesn't mean that you can't have anybody who doesn't agree with your message on, because I've actively invited people onto my podcast before, and I have said to them, you've got this view, and I know that you've got this view. I've got this view, which is polar opposite. I want to do an episode where we basically argue this out. But we've agreed on the fact that we're going to argue that out, and it has suited two narratives on the podcast for podcast listeners. But you do need to kind of consider to yourself, you know, do I want this name associated with my podcast? Do I want those views associated with my podcast? And if the answer is no, can you turn it into a challenge or debate or what have you? And if not, then maybe, you know, just because Bob seems to be the person of the minute and is going on everybody's podcast doesn't mean that you need to invite Bob on your podcast as well.
100%. And I think, because we talk about having a polarizing perspective, it's one of the things that I encourage our clients to have when they go on. Like, just have something that you can stand on your soapbox with. And is it, though, a values match? Like, can you equally discuss, or is it? And also, I think the podcasts that don't always do so well is when it's like, oh my God, I agree with you. Oh my God, I agree with you here. Oh my God, I agree. I have not seen those translate into revenue numbers, because there's so much automatic agreement, because you already are sharing so much of the same message, that there's no friction and that there's no iron sharpening iron. So the only way I've seen that shift is when someone, a guest, is able to really tell a different story and come from a different background than the other person who has the exact same strategies, tools, tactics, etc. Because everyone can have the same strategies and tips and tricks, but no one has her story.
100%. Yeah, 100%. I love that.
So to wrap this up, Verity, because I loved our conversation, what do you look for specifically when you are bringing on guests to your podcast?
Okay, so first of all, if you give me some kind of pitch or email which is so obviously copied and pasted, it just goes. If it opens up with, hey girl, hey there, hey, you know, just something which is just so obviously run of the mill, I won't entertain it at all. If you start off with, I loved your latest episode of your podcast, if that's the first line, again, it goes, because there's nothing that tells me that you've listened to my podcast or my latest episode. But equally, if people go too far and they say, I loved your latest episode this number, and then it just like goes on and on, that you're like, no, you've been too specific. You've copied and pasted that off of Apple Podcasts. So any kind of pitch which just looks like you are trying to get on every single podcast ever, I'm not going to entertain it, because I get, this sounds really big-headed, but I mean, you're probably exactly the same. I don't know how many of those a week, and I can't filter through any of them. Yeah. Absolutely. So anything generic just goes. So I would say just be yourself. The ones, which I know it sounds really ridiculous, but the ones where I'm like, oh, a person has written this, are the ones that I'm going to read. And I want to know, what is it that you want to talk about? What is your expertise for talking about that particular topic? And what value can you bring to my audience? And the reason I say those few things is because, first of all, I get a lot of pitches. I'm sure you're the same, but I get a lot of pitches where people go, I want to come on your podcast. What do you want me to talk about? And I'm like, well, I don't know. What are you an expert in? What do you want to talk about? Like, you're not convincing me to give you airtime. Mm-hmm. So tell me, what is it that you can talk about? Why are you the expert? And when I say you're the expert, I don't mean that you need to have like a PhD in the subject. You don't need to have made like $1 million doing that thing. But it could be, do you know, I've been doing this for the last 2 months and I've just nailed this and I know this and I've got this unique take. It goes back to what you were saying about that unique take and that unique story. So what kind of qualifies you, I guess, for want of a better word? And then that third crucial element for me is, what value does that bring to my audience? Because at the end of the day, if I cannot provide value to my audience through an episode, they're not going to come back. And if that is the first episode that somebody has ever listened to of the podcast and they're like, well, that was a waste of my time, they're not going to come back. They're not going to tell their friends. And if they do tell their friends, they're going to say, don't bother listening to that podcast. So the whole thing is, there's got to be value. And I'm not saying value in terms of, because I think a lot of the time people think that value has to be like a strict how-to or, you know, some kind of education. But, you know, value can be entertainment as well. It can be, you know, telling a story that's relatable, that makes somebody think that, oh, I'm not alone in this situation. But there has to be some element of value, because otherwise, if it's just, oh, I'm coming on to talk about email marketing because I've got 20 years experience in the subject, I'm going to be like, and a lot of people in this world can talk about email marketing. What is it specifically that you can give value? What value is that you can give to my audience specifically? Mm-hmm. So I would say those 3 key things, as well as just don't send generic run-of-the-mill emails, please. Our rule is, if you don't say our name or my name and my podcast name are the easiest 2 things to find. If you don't have either of those in any of the pitch, it's just immediately goes in the trash. Yeah. I won't even respond to the message. I will tell you though, I got the best pitch a couple of weeks ago and I just replied to her. I was like, yes, I need you on my podcast. I did an episode a few weeks ago, actually a couple of months ago, sorry now. And it was all about Taylor Swift, what we can learn from Taylor Swift in relation to podcasting. This girl, I'm interviewing her in a couple of weeks. I'm so excited because she wrote to me. She said, I listened to this episode. She put about 5 different Taylor Swift related puns in it. And I was like, you have put so much effort into this. And she was like, I learned this from your episode. I learned this. And then it was pun. I was like, you're funny as well. I like you. And then she followed it up with another. And I was like, the effort that you have gone to, this is just brilliant. And it told me that she was a person as well. So I just thought it was golden, absolutely golden. Yeah. I love that. And especially like the puns, of being able to show and demonstrate how you pitch or give relatability. Like one of the things that when we pitch our clients, and sometimes it is a little bit more sus with podcast agencies because there's a lot of them and a lot of them don't pitch very well. And like, just going to be honest. And from that space, like, so we go above and beyond and we're like, here's an episode, like, here's what we listened to, here's what we think, like, let's tie in the perspective. And like, our agency has the 8 pitch commandments. And like, whenever we pitch our clients, like every pitch has to match these 8 commandments. One of the first of which is, you know, just have the podcaster's name, for God's sake. Like, just call them by their name. Exactly. Hey, Queen, except for if, like, I will consider it if they say Your Highness. Oh,
I would consider that. I would consider that.
Yeah.
Because then they would have an understanding of our brand. So
yeah, no, I can see that.
For our brand, I can understand that. Not maybe for everybody's, but for ours, I can definitely see that for both of my companies. So that the ability, though, to be relatable, to be to show the puns, to show your personality through the pitch is so essential. And I love that you broke that down so effortlessly. It's just like, make sure that it's a human connecting with a human, and not just, some template. Like, I am all for having templates to a degree. Like, have a template of your bio. But let the bio is one of the last things, because as my very good friend, Precious Pitchmaster Williams said on our Crown Yourself podcast, she says, nobody will care unless you show them how much you care about them.
Yes, it's so true.
And so you got to show a podcaster that you care about them, because especially, like, I love that you take your audience into such deep consideration. And this is something that I've seen consistently with podcasters who have taken the time, who are, top 5%, they are ranked, they're crushing it. They consider their audience and where their audience is coming to their podcast in their journey. And that consideration is like, if you can get their attention to listen to that podcast episode, and like what you said, if that's the first podcast episode that someone listens to, like, it's your goal to hook them and get them into the other podcast to become a subscriber and a listener. And it should be also the podcast guest goal to be able to make that happen for the podcast, because then that's how you create a win-win.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's just, to go back to the point as well about standing out, because I think what a lot of people forget is that if you're putting out weekly content, if you do a guest interview every single week, that's only 52 slots that a podcast has got in a year. That's not actually that many. And, if you look at other podcasts, some podcasters will only do an interview every second episode or once a month. So you really got to make sure that you stand out, because you could be essentially vying for only 12 interviews throughout a whole year for certain podcasts. And I think people forget that sometimes as well when it comes to the quality of their pitches.
Such a good mic drop to end on. And I always love to ask, Verity, what did you love about our conversation today?
That it's so relatable. I feel like I'm just talking to somebody who gets my life. I think that's it. It's been such a relatable conversation. I think, going right back to what we were saying right at the beginning, is we're both very relaxed. We're mums at the end of the day. We've got the kids. If the kids are coming in and out, it's authentic for us. We both get it, and it's authentic for our audience as well. And it's that authenticity piece which is just key for me. So yeah, that would be it.
I love it. Verity, where can we find you? How can we listen to your podcast and learn more about what you're doing for podcasters?
Absolutely. So it's the Lazy Girl's Guide to Podcasting. Each episode is only 10 to 15 minutes long, so they are very, very bingeable. So it is available. Just type in Lazy Girl's Guide to Podcasting or podcasting tips or how to podcast into any podcast app, YouTube. It is there. Otherwise, at Verity Sangan on Twitter and also on Instagram, and the website's veritysangan.com. Everything is there, but check out the podcast, because that's what I'm most passionate about. So Lazy Girl's Guide to Podcasting. Come be a lazy girl or a lazy boy, because we do have a growing little community of people who keep contacting me saying, can I be a lazy boy? And I'm like, yes, come in. We're not exclusive. We're very community spirited over here. Just come join. So yes, Lazy Girl's Guide to Podcasting, open to however you may identify.
I love that. And especially, I think your title of Lazy Girl's Guide to Podcasting is so niche specific, and it plays into like the power of marketing to the niche, but accepting the people that come into your world.
Share it with your friends. For more tips
so
on guest
it's
podcasting,
a beautiful, bingeable podcast. Go listen to the Lazy Girl's Guide to Podcasting. All the links are down below, so it'll make it very easy for you to just click and listen. And make sure you subscribe to the various podcasts and drop some generosity with a rock star rock and review. As always, stand out and let your voice be heard.